Shabbat shalom. May the rest of the sixth day or the Sabbath be upon you, a day that we generally, in my, uh, I guess I should say tradition, follow that we try not to do any work by ourselves. That way we disconnect from the world, have more time to focus on spiritual things. Uh, Quick background what I'm hoping to do on a Sabbath, um, that being a Saturday. I generally start mine on a Friday evening to a Saturday evening. Um, I began this back in about 1998, 99. Um, a little bit about who I am, real quick. Um, I was born and raised Southern Baptist, very traditional Christian, um, very strict Christian. I went off to college. I found out there was more to the spiritual world than what I was led to believe or understand. So through that experience, decided to explore all the opposites of what I was taught, walking away from a faith in just about everything. I then spent a period of years becoming aware of the truth and reality of there being more than a Bible, more than a spirituality than what I was taught. Um, so I began to read ancient texts and began to explore the different possibilities of what might be real in the world around me. Um, Through that, I came into several scary experiences, which I'll share in later time as we read some of these things, um, which brought me back around to the truth and the actual scripture of what we call the Bible. But what I did find is that the Bible was a co opted book by a group to control us and to control our thinking, to keep us in a box. So, what I'm hoping to do with this channel is to begin to read texts outside of that particular box that we have been in, and yet at the same time go back and read scriptures as well so that we can see that it is a spiritual story and not what it's been given to us as, hence the name throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think too often we give up on spirituality because we realize we've been in a spiritual cage. Um, I'm hoping to go through many different texts from what many people would consider different religions. I'm hoping to show that this is all one long historical spiritual story that's been divided up and co-opted different pieces by different cultures to help form their own socialization. Um, that it is all one big long story, and if we begin to read it and read whole pieces of it at a time, we'll begin to see how they interconnect. Realize that yes, they were written by man, but that it was them looking historically, trying to relate the oral things, the spiritual things that they were at that particular time. One thing I learned through reading the ancient texts was when we begin to see the story, it actually goes back as far as some claims 4 million or billion, depending on how you interpret years. Um, there's going to be a lot of controversy because of religious ideas that we've been taught. Because we have been within these systems, it's going to be hard to break our mind out of them, which is going to bring contention between groups. I want everybody to understand everything is free to say on this channel. You may bring up any point, give any argument, but let's please keep this from being personal on this channel. Um, Real quick, I'm going to say thank you, Jetta Joe and Green Body, for being the first ones to join me on this little journey. What I'm hoping to do, I'm describing as I go. I'm not going to particularly take time to sit and greet everybody on this first opening part. So give me just a few minutes so that this becomes a continuous thing when people go back and watch this start. Um, Appreciate it, everybody who's dropping in. Um, in my journey, it brought me back around to the realization that there was a creator and that we had an option to either emulate or worship, as some say, that creator, or to try to emulate and worship that which was created. And as you begin to read through these texts, you'll see that each different history has sets of spiritual laws, and these laws are in place and they have different names, but they all come back to the same central core values. And where we begin to take and dissect names and words, often we begin to have offenses between people, and I would like that to stay out of it. I'd like to us to try as a group to understand the differences between our definitions of these words so we can see where truth has been robbed from us. Because in all of the scriptures, you will find at some place or another it says that in the last days, it's going to be impossible to find the whole truth because it's going to be divided up among everything. You're going to basically say they're going to go all over the world hunting for the truth, and they're only going to find pieces here and there. And what we're seeing now with archaeology, with science, with all the things that are coming out, the spiritual world and the physical world are interconnected. And what we considered magic is now considered science, which one day may be considered biology. I mean, all these things need to be looked at, and the warnings of these different scriptures taken into effect. But my main aim is for us to be able to read through these things, begin to see these spiritual laws and apply them to helping bring about positive growth in our lives and in our community, to begin to use these spiritual laws and teachings to help. I know the word enlightened is kind of hokey, but be a bigger light to others. Um, that being said, um, generally on a Sabbath, I would sit down with my kids from the time they were very young, and I would read. At first, it was the Bible because we were in religious circles at that time. When my children were born, I came out of occultic circles into ultra religious. So I kind of did the big swing of the pendulum. And as I describe my journey, you'll see that I did a lot of pendulum swinging back and forth in my beliefs. And it that that helped me understand what the yin and the yang meant, or what reaping and sowing meant. And so each Saturday, I would sit down usually with my kids around 10 a.m. and we would begin to read wherever we left off in the scripture. And by the time they were 18 years old, we had read through the Bible at least 6 or 8 times with them. We had read through many of the extra biblical texts at least 2 or 3 times. And I had begun to read some of the ancient texts to them through at least once. So my kids got an education in the different um, spiritual beliefs and understandings from a fairly young age themselves. And I miss doing that because I've lost it over the last couple of years with the kids leaving, with inter family relationship issues and problems, with even beliefs between me and my own wife. So I'd like to begin to sit down and start again with reading. And this season for us was called Hanukkah, and it's a representation of a spiritual picture that occurs both in the Bible and in uh, readings outside of the Bible. And I got a quick question. When I go to this page to look at my actual text. Does that make my camera go out? I'm going to switch back and see if I can read the chat. I may have to find a second tablet. But anyways, the story of what happened, the history of what happened for Hanukkah comes from First Maccabees, and I'm going to take a few minutes and today make that my reading. I'm going to read for what feels comfortable and then stop. Generally, with the kids, we would often read until we finished either a whole book or a whole section of a story, or sometimes it was something the kids were interested in. We'd read all day. But I'm going to take this time to read about what happened between what we call the Old Testament and the New Testament. Alexander of Macedon, son of Philip, had come from the land of Kittim and defeated Darius, king of the Persians and Medes, whom he succeeded as ruler at first of Hellas, which is a season. He undertook many campaigns, gained possession of many fortresses, and put local kings to death. So he advanced to the ends of the earth, plundering nation after nation. The earth grew silent before him, and his ambitious heart swelled with pride. He assembled very powerful forces and subdued provinces, nations, and princes, and they became his tributaries. But the time came when Alexander took to his bed in the knowledge that he was dying. He summoned his officers, noblemen who had been brought up with him from his youth, and divided his kingdom among them while he was still alive. Alexander had reigned 12 years when he died. Each of his officers established himself in his own region. And in case nobody's caught on, this is Alexander the Great. All assumed crowns after his death, they and their heirs after them for many years, bringing increasing evils on the world. From these there grew a wicked offshoot, Antiochus Epiphanes, son of King Antiochus, once a hostage in Rome. He became king in the 107th year of the kingdom of the Greeks. It was then that there emerged from Israel a set of renegades who led many people astray. Come, they said, let us ally ourselves with Gentiles surrounding us, for since we separated ourselves from them, many misfortunes have overtaken us. This proposal proved acceptable, and a number of people eagerly approached the king, who authorized them to practice the Gentiles' observances. And they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem, such as the Gentiles have, disguised their circumcision, and abandoned the Holy Covenant, submitting to Gentile rule as willing slaves of impiety. Once Antiochus had seen his authority established, he determined to make himself king of Egypt and ruler of both kingdoms. He invaded Egypt in massive strength, with chariots and elephants and cavalry and a large fleet. He engaged Ptolemy, king of Egypt, in battle, and Ptolemy turned back and fled before his advance, leaving many casualties. The fortified cities of Egypt were captured, and Antiochus plundered the country. After his conquest of Egypt in the year 143, Antiochus turned about and advanced on Israel and Jerusalem in massive strength. Insolently breaking into the sanctuary, he removed the golden altar and the lampstand for the light with all of its fittings. And that's the menorah. Together with the table of loaves of permanent offering, the libation vessels, the cups, the golden censers, the veil, the crowns, the golden decorations of the front of the temple, which he stripped of everything. He made off with the silver and the gold, the precious vessels. He discovered the secret treasures and seized them. And removing all these, he went back to his own country, having shed much blood, and uttered words of extreme arrogance. There was a deep mourning for Israel throughout the country. Rulers and elders groaned. Girls and young men wasted away. The women's beauty suffered a change. Every bridegroom took up a dirge. The bride sat, grief-stricken, on her marriage bed. The earth quaked because of its inhabitants, and the whole house of Jacob was clothed with shame. 2 years later, the king sent Mishak through the cities of Judah. He came to Jerusalem with an impressive force, and addressing them with what appeared to be peaceful words, he gained their confidence. Then suddenly he fell on the city, dealing it a terrible blow, and destroying many of the people of Israel. He pillaged the city and set it on fire, tore down its houses and encircling wall, took the women and children captive, and commandeered the cattle. Then he rebuilt the city of David with great strong wall and strong towers, and made this their citadel. There they installed a brood of sinners of renegades, who fortified themselves inside it, storing arms and provisions, and depositing there the loot they had collected from Jerusalem. They were to prove a great trouble. It became an ambush for the sanctuary, an evil adversary for Israel at all times. They shed innocent blood all around that sanctuary, and defiled the sanctuary itself. The citizens of Jerusalem fled because of them. She became a dwelling place of strangers. Estranged from her own offspring, her children forsook her. Her sanctuary became as forsaken as a desert. Her feasts were turned into mourning, her Sabbaths into a mockery, her honor into a reproach. Her dishonor now fully matched her former glory. Her greatness was turned into grief. The king then issued a proclamation to his whole kingdom that they were to become a single people, each nation renouncing its particular customs. All the Gentiles conformed to the king's decree, and many Israelites chose to accept his religion, sacrificing to idols and profaning the Sabbath. The king also sent edicts by messenger to Jerusalem and towns of Judah, directing them to adopt customs foreign to the country, banning burnt offerings, sacrifices, and libations from the sanctuary, profaning Sabbaths and feasts, defiling the sanctuary and everything holy, building altars, shrines, and temples for idols, sacrificing pigs and unclean beasts, leaving their sons uncircumcised, and prostituting themselves to all kinds of impurity and abomination, so that they should forget the law and revoke all observance of it. Anyone not obeying the king's command was to be put to death. Writing in such terms to every part of his kingdom, the king appointed inspectors for the whole people, and directed all the towns of Judah to offer sacrifice city by city. Many of the people, that is, every apostate from the law, rallied to them, and so committed evil in the country, forcing Israel into hiding in any possible place of refuge. On the 15th day of Chislev, in the year 145, the king built the appalling abomination on top of the altar of burnt offering. The altars were built in the surrounding towns of Judah, and incense offered at the doors of the houses and in the streets. Any books of the law that came to light were torn up and burned. Whenever anyone was discovered possessing a copy of the covenant or practicing the law, the king's decree sentenced him to death. Month after month, they took harsh action against any offenders they discovered in the towns of Israel. On the 25th day of each month, sacrifice was offered on the altar erected on top of the altar of burnt offering. Women who had their children circumcised were put to death according to the edict, with their babies hung around their necks, and the members of their households and those who had performed the circumcision were executed with them. Yet there were many in Israel who stood firm and found courage to refuse unclean food. They chose death rather than contamination by such fare of profa- of, or profa- such fare or profa- I can't say it, profanation of the Holy Covenant, and they were executed. It was truly dreadful retribution that visited Israel. All right, that's the first chapter of it. I'm going to take just a minute to come back here for a second. I figure out what method or how we're going to do this. Does my camera stay up while I'm reading? A quick couple questions. If y'all could help me figure this out. This being my first time. Mr. Greenbody, Alyssa, Jetta, Main Green. Thank y'all for coming in. I'm reading Maccabees because it is the story of Hanukkah, and it's also part of a lot of things that happen prophetically before and after. It was purposely left out of the Bible to make sure people didn't understand there was a continuity of history between the Old and New Testament. It helped them to form two separate religions within one. Let's see, maybe listening, not able to type for a minute, or I don't know what my delay is on this. I know this is going to be dead air for just a second, but I'm trying to back up. I do thank everybody for sharing. Anytime there's any questions or anything you want to throw in there, I'll try to take a break and check on it. I'm going to continue this history with the next segment. And this is where we begin to see the kickback against the invasion. About then, Matthias, son of John, son of Simeon, a priest of the line of Jorib, left Jerusalem and settled in the Moedim. He had 5 sons: John, also known as Gadi, Simon called Thasi, Judas called Maccabeus, Eleazar called Avron, and Jonathan called Apophis. When he saw the blasphemies being committed in Judah and Jerusalem, he said, "Alas, I should have been born to witness the ruin of my people and the ruin of the holy city, and to sit by while she is delivered over to her enemies, and the sanctuary into the hand of foreigners. Her temple has become like someone of no repute. The vessels that were her glory have been carried off as booty. Her babies have been slaughtered in her street, her young men by the enemy's sword. Is there a nation that has not claimed a share of her royal prerogatives, that has not taken some of her spoils? All her ornaments have been snatched from her. Her former freedom has become slavery. See how the holy place or beauty or glory is now laid waste. See how the Gentiles have profaned it. What have we left to live for? Matthias his son tore their garments, put on sackcloth, and observed deep mourning. The king's commissioners, who were enforcing the apostasy, came to the town of Modin for the sacrifices. Many Israelites gathered around them, but Matthias and his sons drew apart. The king's commissioners then addressed Matthias as follows: "You are a respected leader, a great man in this town. You have sons and brothers to support you. Be the first to step forward and conform to the king's decree, as all the nations have done, and the leaders of Judah and the survivors in Jerusalem. You and your sons shall be reckoned among the friends of the king. You and your sons will be honored with gold and silver and many presents." Raising his voice, Matthias retorted, "Even if every nation living in the king's dominions obeys him, each forsaking its ancestral religion to conform to his decrees, I, my sons, and my brothers will still follow the covenant of our ancestors. May heaven preserve us from forsaking the law and its observances. And as for the king's orders, we will not follow them. We shall not swerve from our own religion, either to the right or to the left." As he finished speaking, a Jew came forward in the sight of all to offer sacrifice on the altar in the Modin, as a royal edict required. When Matthias saw this, he was fired with zeal. Stirred to the depth of his being, he gave his vent to his legitimate anger. He threw himself on the man and slaughtered him on the altar. At the same time, he killed the king's commissioner who was there to enforce the sacrifice, and tore down the altar. In his zeal for the law, he acted as Phinehas had against Zimri the son of Salu. And that is a story found in the Tanakh, or the Old Testament. Then Matthias went through the town, shouting at the top of his voice, "Let everyone who has any zeal for the law and takes his stand on the covenant come out and follow me." Then he fled with his sons into the hills, leaving all their possessions behind in the town. Many people who were concerned for virtue and justice went down to the desert and stayed there, taking with them their sons, their wives, and their cattle. So oppressive had their sufferings become. Word was brought to the royal officials and forces stationed in Jerusalem, in the city of David, that those who had repudiated the king's edict had gone down to the hiding places in the desert. A strong detachment went after them, and when it came up with them, ranged itself against them in battle formation, preparing to attack them on the Sabbath day, and said, "Enough of this. Come out and do as the king orders, and you will be spared." The others, however, replied, "We refuse to come out, and we will not obey the king's orders and profane the Sabbath day." The royal forces at once went into action, but the others offered no opposition. Not a stone was thrown. There was no barricading of the hiding places. They only said, "Let us all die innocent. Let heaven and earth bear witness that you are massacring us with no pretense of justice." The attack was so pressed home on the Sabbath itself that they were slaughtered with their wives and children and cattle to the number of 1,000 persons. When the news reached Matthias and his friends, they mourned them bitterly, and said to one another, "If we all do as our brothers have done, and refuse to fight the Gentiles for our lives and institutions, they will only destroy us the sooner from the earth." So then and there they came to this decision: if anyone attacks us on the Sabbath day, whoever he may be, we shall resist him. We must not all be killed, as our brothers were in the hiding places. Soon they were joined by the Hasidian party, stout fighting men of Israel, each one of the volunteer on the side of the law. All of the refugees from the persecutions rallied to them, giving them added support. They organized themselves into an armed force, striking down the sinners in their anger and the renegades in their fury, and those who escaped them fled to the Gentiles for safety. Matthias and his friends made a tour overthrowing the altars, and forcibly circumcising all boys they found uncircumcised in the territories of Israel. They hunted down the upstarts and managed their campaign to good effect. They wrested the law out of control of the Gentiles and the king and reduced the sinners to impotence. As the days of Matthias were drawing to a close, he said to his son, "Arrogance and outrage are now in the ascendant. It is a period of turmoil and bitter hatred. This is the time, my children, for you to have a burning zeal for the law, and give yourselves lives for the covenant of our ancestors. Remember the deeds performed by our ancestors, each in his generation, and you will win great honor and everlasting renown. Was not Abraham tested and found faithful? Was that not considered as justifying him? Joseph, in the time of his distress, maintained the law and so became Lord of Egypt. Phinehas, our father, in return for his burning zeal, received the covenant of everlasting priesthood. Joshua, for carrying out his tasks, became judge of Israel. Caleb, for his testimony before the assembled people, received an inheritance in the land. David, for his generous heart, inherited the throne of an everlasting kingdom. Elijah, for his consuming fervor for the law, was caught up into heaven itself. Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, for their fidelity, were saved from the flame. Daniel, for his singleness of heart, was rescued from the lion's jaw. Know then that generation after generation, no one hopes in him, will be overcome. Do not fear the threats of the sinner. All his brave show must come to the dunghill and the worms. Exalted today, tomorrow he is nowhere to be found, for he has returned to the dust he came from, and his scheming is brought to nothing. My children, be resolute and courageous for the law, for it will bring you glory. Here is your brother Simeon. I know he is a man of sound judgment. Listen to him all your lives. Let him take your father's place. Judas Maccabeus, strong and brave from his youth, let him be your general and conduct the war against the Gentiles. The rest of you are to enroll in your ranks all those who keep the law and assure the vengeance of your people. Pay back the Gentiles to the full and hold fast to the ordinance of the law. Then he blessed them and was joined to his ancestors. He died in the year 146 and was buried in his ancestral tomb at Modin, and all Israel mourned him deeply. All right, that's a chapter break. I'm going to take a quick stop and break. Hog, thanks for joining us. I'm going to take a couple tokes and a couple hits off the thing here to get a little nicotine. Anybody coming in later time watching these, or anybody here now that doesn't know already, I am a medical patient with a card in Florida. It is legal for me to smoke, but I am not allowed to encourage anybody else to do. But I will say cheers, as it is my medicine, and it is many of yours medicine. I do have Crohn's and degenerative bone disease, and sitting here for long periods is getting a little uncomfortable. Shalom, or peace. As I tell my story while I'm reading different things and texts over time, I have gone in and out of belief as to whether or not pot was spiritually acceptable, and it took me a long time to realize that in every single text it was given as both food and medicine, including the Bible. And as with any food or medicine, we can abuse it. And I think that's where each one of us has a conscience within ourselves that lets us know where those stages are. And it's not for each one of us to decide where that is in another person, because we don't know what they're going through at the time. And if we can keep a non-judgmental attitude through the different things, it will help us get through these different studies as we read, because a lot of these texts are very controversial because of what we've been taught to believe. James, thanks for joining me today, brother. I'm going to be doing a weekly reading starting about 10 o'clock every Sabbath morning. I used to do this with my children. On this beginning one, I started with Maccabees because it is the season of Hanukkah for us, just ending. And this is the story of what happened. It does tie the Old and New Testament together. And between chapters, I'm taking real quick breaks and seeing how things are going and who's joined us. I'm going to figure out how this process is going to go, and we'll all learn together. I'm hoping to read through texts from all different ages and times, different places in the world before this is done. It generally took me about 2 to 3 years to read through a set of texts with my kids. We did it until it wasn't comfortable each Sabbath, and I hope to do the same here. Cheers. Yep, and for those who celebrate the Christian tradition and some of the other secular traditions of Christmas, Merry Christmas to you. I think sometimes we get a little hung up and worried about blessing other people that we forget that they're looking for the same things in their holidays that we look for in ours, that time of fellowship, that time of togetherness, for that feeling of family, for that feeling of spirit. And when we begin to judge each other's holidays, we're judging the religious structure behind it, which I think we should do in an open mind, but we don't need to judge each other's motivations, which is often hurtful. So when we bless each other, which is something we're to do, we're either to choose to bless or curse. We need to remember to say happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and quit getting hung up in all the words. My little tent, bless hands, thanks for joining me. I've advanced now to the next chapter. We're in the third chapter of the first Maccabees, and I'm reading from the Catholic Online. It just happens they had the biggest print for me to read today. His son, Judas, known as Maccabeus, then took his place, and that's his father's place. All his brothers and all who had attached themselves to his father supported him, and they fought for Israel with a will. He extended the fame of his people like a giant. He put on the breastplate, and he buckled on his war harness. He engaged in battle after battle, protecting the ranks with his sword. He was like a lion in his exploits, like a young lion roaring over his prey. He pursued and tracked down the renegades. He consigned to those who troubled his people to the flames. The renegades quailed with terror he inspired. All evildoers were utterly confounded, and deliverance went forward under his leadership. He brought bitterness to many a king, and rejoicing to Jacob by his deeds. His memory is blessed forever and ever. He went through the towns of Judah, eliminating the irreligious from them, and diverted the retribution from Israel. His name resounded to the ends of the earth. He rallied those who were on the point of perishing. Next, Apollonius mustered the Gentiles and a large force from Samaria to make war on Israel. When Judas learned of it, he went out to meet him and routed and killed him. Many fell wounded, and survivors took to flight. Their spoils were seized, and the sword of Apollonius was taken by Judas, who used it to fight with throughout his life. On hearing that Judas had raised a mixed force of believers and seasoned fighters, Sarin, king of the Syrian troops, said, I shall make a name for myself and gain honor in the kingdom if I fight Judas and those supporters of his who are so contemptuous of the king's orders. He therefore launched another expedition with a strong army of unbelievers to support him in taking revenge on the Israelites. He had nearly reached the descent of Beth Horon when Judas went out to confront him with a handful of men. But as soon as he saw uh, the force advancing to meet them, they said to Judas, how can we, few as we are, engage such overwhelming numbers? We are exhausted as it is, not having had anything to eat today. It is easy, Judas answered, for a great number to be defeated by a few. Indeed, in the sight of heaven, deliverance, whether by many or by few, is all one. For victory in war does not depend on the size of the fighting force. Heaven accords the strength. They are coming against us in full-blown insolence and lawlessness to destroy us, our wives and our children, and to plunder us. But we are fighting for our lives and our laws, and he will crush them before our eyes. Do not be afraid of them. When he had finished speaking, he made a sudden sally against Saron and his forces and overwhelmed them. Judas pursued them down to Beth Horon as far as the plain. About 800 of their men fell, and the rest took refuge in the country of the Philistines. Judas and his brother began to be feared, and alarm seized the surrounding peoples. His name even reached the king's ears, and among the nations there was talk of Judas and his battles. The news of these events infuriated Antiochus, and he ordered mobilization of all the forces in his kingdom, a very powerful army. Opening his treasury, he distributed a year's pay to his troops, telling them to be prepared for any eventuality. He then found that the money in his coffers had run short, and that the tribute of the province had decreased as a result of the dissension and the disaster brought on the country by his own abrogation of laws that had been in force from antiquity. He began to fear that, and as had happened more than once, he would not have enough to cover the expenses and lavish bounties he had previously been accustomed to make on a larger scale than his predecessor on the throne. In this grave quandary, he resolved to invade Persia, there to levy tribute on the provinces and so accumulate substantial funds. He therefore left Lysias, a nobleman and member of the royal family, to manage the royal affairs between the river Euphrates and the Egyptian frontier, making him responsible for the education of his son Antiochus until he should come back. To him Antiochus made over half his forces with the elephants. I said that wrong. Yeah. To him Antiochus made over half his forces with the elephants, giving him instructions about what he wanted done, particularly with regards to the inhabitants of Judea and Jerusalem, against whom he was to send a force to crush and destroy the power of Israel and the remnant of Jerusalem, to wipe out their very memory from the place, to settle foreigners in all parts of their territory, and to distribute their land into lots. The king took the remaining half of his troops with him and set out from Antioch, the capital of his kingdom, in the year 147. He crossed the river Euphrates and made his way through the upper provinces. Lysias chose Ptolemy, son of Dormenes, with Nicanor and Gorgias, influential men from among the friends of the king, and under their command dispatched 40,000 foot and 7,000 horse to invade the land of Judah and devastate it, as the king had ordered. The entire force set out and reached the neighborhood of Emmaus in the lowland, where they pitched camp. The local merchants, hearing the news of this, arrived at the camp, bringing with them a large amount of gold and silver and fetters, as well as proposing to buy the Israelites as slaves. They were accompanied by a company from Idumea and the Philistine country. Judas and his brothers saw that the situation was going from bad to worse, and that the armies were camping in their territory. They were also well aware that the king had ordered the people's total destruction. So they said to each other, "Let us restore the ruins of our people, and fight for our people in our sanctuary." The assembly was summoned to prepare for war, to offer prayer, and to implore compassion and mercy. Jerusalem was empty as a desert, none of her children to go in and out. The sanctuary was trodden underfoot. Men of an alien race held the citadel, which had become a lodging for Gentiles. There was no more rejoicing for Jacob. The flute and the lyre were mute. After mustering, they made their way to Mizpah, opposite Jerusalem, since Mizpah was traditionally a place of prayer for Israel. That day they fasted and put on sackcloth, covering their heads with ashes and tearing their garments. For the guidance that the Gentiles would have sought from the images of their false gods, they opened the book of the law. They also brought out the priestly vestments with first fruits and tithes, and marshaled the Nazarites who had completed the period of their vow. Then, raising their voices to heaven, they cried, "What shall we do with these people, and where are we to take them? Your holy place has been trampled underfoot and defiled. Your priests mourn in their humiliation, and now the Gentiles are in alliance to destroy us. You know what they have in mind for us. How can we stand up and face them if you do not come to our aid?" Then they sounded the trumpet and raised a great shout. Next, Judas appointed leaders for the people to command 1,000, 100, 50, and 10 men. Those who were in the middle of the building of those who were in the middle of building a house, or were about to be married, or were planting a vineyard, or were afraid. He told them to go home again, as the law allowed. The column then marched off and took up a position south of Emmaus. "Stand to your arms," Judas told them. "Acquit yourselves bravely in the morning. Be ready to fight these Gentiles massed against us to destroy us in our sanctuary. Better for us to die in battle than to watch the ruin of our nation and our holy place. Whatever be the will of heaven, he will perform it." And that's our next chapter break. Good morning, Mr. Bone and Rex's people. Thanks for joining us. take a brief read here. Rex's people, if you hang out with me from week to week, you're going to find I'm going to be reading through a whole lot of stuff. I am planning on reading through different texts, uh, ancient and even some that have just currently been found from what many people say different religions, but I see them as different histories. They all come together when you read through them. I'm just starting with this one just because it's part of the time of year, and I've always read this during this time of year to my kids. And if you go back and start from the beginning of this, you'll see that I plan on making this a continuous journey. Um, as a brief interlude between chapters here, I will say I'm debating on which text to start with first, whether to be the Sumerian tablets or the Egyptian emerald tablets. There's some really good, interesting stuff in those. Um, we will eventually read through the actual biblical scripture, but I want to read enough of the other texts to show that this is all one continuous thought that was been purposely taken away from us and broken up and made so that we won't have truth in these last days. Budget Bud, cheers. Thanks for joining. Hidden Harvest Grow Lights, thanks for joining. Um, I'm taking a break between each one of these chapters. Something I was just thinking as I was doing this, we used to do this as well. The kids would run and go get a drink, or somebody would go to the bathroom, or this is how we had the little interlude periods. So this is kind of entertaining how this is playing out. But something we did is we just would start read until we weren't comfortable reading for the day, and then pick it up the next week and decide what text we wanted to read next. And some of these texts would be controversial and spark argument. Let's try to remember, folks, to keep this about ideas and not about personal attacks. That's the only thing we're going to watch for here. Is we don't want this to be personal. We want us all to learn from the differences as much as from the similarities. I'm going to return back to this story. And this is going into chapter 4. Georges took with him 5,000 foot and 1,000 picked cavalry, and force moved off by night, with the object of attacking the Jewish position and dealing them an unexpected blow. The men from the citadel were there to guide him. Judas got wind of it, and himself moved off with his fighters to strike at the royal army at Emmaus, while its fighting troops were still dispersed outside the camp. Hence, when Georges reached his Judas camp, he found no one, and began looking for the Jews in the mountains, for he said, "We've got them on the run." First light found Judas in the plain with 3,000 men. Although these lacked armor and sword that they would have wished, they could now see the Gentile encampment with its strong fortification and cavalry surrounding it. Clearly people who understood warfare. Judas said to his men, "Do not be afraid of their numbers. Do not flinch at their attack. Remember how our ancestors were delivered at the Red Sea when Pharaoh was pursuing them in force. And now let us call on heaven. If he cares for us, he will remember his covenant with our ancestors and will destroy this army confronting us today. Then all the nations will know for certain that there is one who ransoms and saves Israel." The foreigners looked up, and seeing the Jews advancing against them, came out of the camp to join battle. Judas's men sounded the trumpet and engaged them. The Gentiles were defeated and fled toward the plain, and all the stragglers fell by the sword. The pursuit continued as far as Gezer and the plains of Idumea, Azotus, and Jamnia, and the enemy lost about 3,000 men. Breaking off pursuit, Judas returned with his men, and said to the people, "Never mind the booty, for we have another battle ahead of us. Georges and his troops are still near us in the mountains. First, stand up to our enemies and fight them, and then you can safely collect the booty." The words were hardly out of Judas's mouth when a detachment came into view, peering down from the mountain. Observing that their own troops had been routed and that the camp had been fired, since the smoke which they could see attested the fact, they were panic-stricken at the sight, and when furthermore they saw Judah's troops drawn up for battle on the plain, they all fled into Philistine territory. Judas then turned back to plunder the camp, and a large sum in gold and silver, with violet and sea-purple stuffs, and many other valuables were carried off. On their return, the Jews chanted praises to heaven, singing, "He is kind and his love is everlasting." That day had been seen as a remarkable deliverance in Israel. Those of the foreigners who had escaped came and gave Lysias an account of all that had happened. The news shocked and dismayed him, for affairs in Israel had not gone as he intended, and the result was quite the opposite to what the king had ordered. The next year he mobilized 60,000 picked troops and 5,000 cavalry with the intention of finishing off the Jews. They advanced into Idumea and made their base at Beth-zur, where Judas met them with 10,000 men. When he saw their military strength, he offered this prayer: "Blessed are you, Savior of Israel, who shattered the mighty warrior's attack at the hand of your servant David, and delivered the Philistine camp into the hands of Jonathan, son of Saul, and his armor-bearer. Crush this expedition in the same way at the hands of your people Israel. Let their troops and the cavalry bring them nothing but shame. So panic in their ranks, confound their confidence that they put in their numbers, and send them reeling in defeat. Overthrow them by the sword of those who love you, and all who acknowledge your name will sing your praises." The two forces engaged, and 5,000 men of Lysias' troops fell in hand-to-hand fighting. Seeing the rout of his army, and the courage of Judas's troops, and their readiness to live or die nobly, Lysias withdrew to Antioch, where he recruited mercenaries for a further invasion of Judea in an even greater strength. Judas and his brothers then said, "Now that our enemies have been defeated, let us go up to purify the sanctuary and dedicate it." So they marshaled the whole army and went up to Mount Zion. There they found the sanctuary deserted, the altar desecrated, the gates burnt down, and the vegetation growing in the courts as it might in a wood or on some mountain, while the storerooms were in ruins. They tore their garments and mourned bitterly, putting dust on their heads. They prostrated themselves on the ground, and when the trumpets gave the signal, they cried aloud to heaven. Judas then ordered his men to keep the citadel garrison engaged until he purified the sanctuary. Next, he selected priests who were blameless and zealous for the law, to purify the sanctuary and remove the stones of pollution to some unclean place. They discussed what should be done about the altar of burnt offering which had been profaned, and very properly decided to pull it down rather than later be embarrassed about it, since it had been defiled by Gentiles. Therefore they demolished it, and they deposited the stones in a suitable place on the hill of the dwelling, to await the appearance of a prophet who should give a ruling about them. They took unhewn stones as the law prescribed, and built a new altar on the lines of the old one. I'm going to take a brief pause here because this is actually going to make a difference in some of the stuff we read outside of the Bible. But if you notice, they took those stones that had been used in ritual sacrifice and stuck them someplace and waited for a holy man to come back, so they would know exactly how to properly spiritually disperse of those stones. It's something that's kind of quickly read through here, but it's very interesting fact for later. They restored the holy place in the interior of the dwelling and purified the courts. They made new sacred vessels and brought the lampstand, the altar of incense, and the table into the temple. They burned incense on the altar and then lit the lamps on the lampstand, and these shone inside of the temple. They placed the loaves on the table and hung the curtains and completed all the tasks they had undertaken. On the 25th of the ninth month, Chislev, in the 148th year, they rose at dawn and offered a lawful sacrifice on the new altar of burnt offering which they had made. The altar was dedicated to the sound of hymns, zithers, lyres, and cymbals. At the same time of the year, on the same day on which the Gentiles had originally profaned it, the whole people fell prostrate in adoration and then praised heaven who had granted them success. For 8 days they celebrated the dedication of the altar, joyfully offering burnt offerings, communion, and thanksgiving sacrifices. They ornamented the front of the temple with crowns and bosses of gold, renovated the gates and storerooms, providing the latter with doors. There was no end to the rejoicing among the people, since the disgrace inflicted by the Gentiles had been effaced. Judas with his brothers, the whole assembly of Israel, made it a law that the days of the dedication of the altar should be celebrated yearly at the proper season for 8 days, beginning on the 25th of the month of Chislev, with rejoicing and gladness. And that's the beginning of Hanukkah. Then they proceeded to build high walls with strong towers round Mount Zion to prevent the Gentiles from coming and riding roughshod over it, as in the past. Judah stationed a garrison there to guard it, and he fortified Beth-zur, so that the people would have a fortress confronting Idumea. And that is a chapter break. I'm going to refresh myself real quickly what comes up. Okay. Come back here, see who all's coming in. Hey, how you doing, Lost Dog? Thanks for joining in. I told you I was going to do some weekly readings. I've started here in Maccabees as it matches the season of Hanukkah. And one thing I wanted to bring up real quick here at the little station identification breaker between the chapters, which were actually added later before this book was yanked out of the Bible, that my brain just went blank. I think I need to give it a reminder. Everybody, let's have a cheer session for a second. This story comes between what we call the Old Testament and the New Testament, and it's about Antiochus Epiphanes when he came as a Greek and took over the Israeli area. Keeping in mind that at one point in time, the different laws of man were divided among the 70 nations, and Israel was given a specific set of laws to guard. They saw this as an abomination. And you'll find that this story repeats itself in many of the different epics, and it repeats itself again at 70 AD after what we consider the death of Jesus, or some say Yeshua, some say the Christ. We'll discuss that in another time. And it is prophetically told in many different places that this is once again going to repeat itself at some point in our future, signaling another great destruction. And if you read the Revelation in the Bible, you find out that there's actually another period after that one, and it happens again. So this is actually a repeating story that goes throughout history. And as we begin to read these different old texts, you're going to begin to see how this story repeats itself. And the reason why the story repeats itself is to show that this is a constant conflict between a morality of light and darkness, or light and nothingness, as I like to call it, because there is really no darkness without light. So that's kind of what they want, is nothingness as opposed to darkness. But that's for a whole nother discussion as well. I'm going to take a break. Big drink. couple of nicotine drags here. Hello, Ed. Thanks for joining us. I'm gonna tell about my own spiritual journey as we go through, and I read some of this stuff. A little bit earlier in this, I briefly explained I was raised as a Southern Baptist Christian. I walked off into the occult for a period of time upon finding out that Christianity was a religious structure, not a spirituality. Um, Through that, I learned the truth of the spirits and came full circle to a belief that we have a choice of either serving a creator or the created. And I found this story repeats itself through all the different texts. And I have read these texts on Saturday. It's been something I've done now since about 1996. Started reading them to my kids around 1998. And I'm in turn now starting to do a series here live, reading these texts. I'm hoping to create an open forum where we can discuss things calmly and rationally and talk about all these different ideas, both the likenesses and differences, and keep the personal out of it and realize these are not attacks against the structures that we were grown up in our belief systems, but hopefully we can come to an understanding. I started in Maccabees because in the way that I now believe and follow, I do Hanukkah, and this is a story. And this is one of the stories that we're going to find repeats itself through all these different ancient texts. And I hope we begin to find some unity as opposed to so much division. Um, Heading on now into 5. When the surrounding nations heard that the altar had been rebuilt and the sanctuary restored to what it had been before, they became very angry and decided to destroy the descendants of Jacob living among them. We began to murder and evict our people. Judas made war on the sons of Esau in Idumea, in the region of Acrabata, Acrabat, Acrabatine, where they were besieging the Israelites. He dealt them a serious blow, drove them off, and despoiled them. He also remembered the wickedness of the sons of Bain, who were a menace and a trap for the people with their ambushes on the road. Having blockaded them in their town and besieged them, he put them under the curse of destruction. He then set fire to their towers and burned them down with everyone inside. Next, he crossed over to the Ammonites, where he found a strong fighting force and a numerous people commanded by Timotheus. He fought many battles with them, defeated them, and cut them to pieces. Having captured Jazer and its dependent villages, he retired to Judea. Next, the Gentiles of Gilead banded together to destroy the Israelites living in their territory. The latter, however, took refuge in the fortresses of Dathema and sent the following letter to Judas and his brothers. The Gentiles round us have banded themselves together against us to destroy us, and they are preparing to storm the fortress in which we have taken refuge. Timotheus is in command of their forces. Come at once and rescue us from their clutches, for we have already suffered great losses. All our countrymen living in Tobias' country have been killed. Their women and children have been taken into captivity. Their property has been seized, and about 1,000 men have been destroyed there. While the letter was being read, other messengers arrived from Galilee with their garments torn, bearing similar news. The people of Ptolemais, Tyre, and Sidon have joined forces with the whole of the Gen- uh, Gentile Galilee to destroy us. When Judas and the people heard this, they held a great assembly and decided what should be done for their oppressed countrymen who were under attack from their enemies. Judas said to his brother Simon, "Pick your men and go to relieve your countrymen in the Galilee. while my brother Jonathan and I make our way into Gilead." He left Joseph son of Zechariah and the people's leader Azariah with the remainder of the army in Judea to keep guard, and gave them these orders: "You are to be responsible for our people. Do not engage the Gentiles until we return." Simon was allotted 3,000 men for the expedition into Galilee, Judas 8,000 for Gilead. Simon advanced into Galilee, engaged the Gentiles in several battles, and swept all before him. He pursued them to the gate of Ptolemais, and they lost about 3,000 men, whose spoils he collected. With him he took away the Jews of Galilee and Arbata, with their wives and children and all their possessions, and he brought them into Judea with great rejoicing. Meanwhile, Judas Maccabeus and his brother Jonathan crossed the Jordan and made a 3 days' march through the desert, where they encountered the Nabateans, who gave them a friendly reception and told them everything that had been happening to their brothers in Gilead, many of whom they said were shut up in Bozrah and Bozer, Elamah, Chaspo, Maked, and Karnaim, all large fortified towns. I'm going to interject something right here. This is also why there's so much war that continually goes on in this area, because they always, for generations, have back and forth just gone, killed all the men, stealed all the kids and wives, and all their stuff, and taken over their area. So they're really actually all just really one big family, but anyways, it's all about the ideas. Many of whom they said were shut up in Bozrah and Bosner. Anyways, I read that part. Others were blockaded in other towns of Gilead, and the enemy planned to attack and capture these strongholds the very next day and destroy all the people inside them on one day. Judas and his army at once turned off by the desert road to Bozrah. He took the town, and having put all the males to the sword and collected the booty, burned it down. When the night came, he left the place, and they continued their march until they reached the fortress. In the light of dawn they looked, and there was an innumerable horde setting up ladders and engines to capture the fortress, and the assault was just beginning. When Judas saw that the attack had begun, and that the war cry was raising to heaven from the city, mingled with trumpet calls and a great clamor, he said to the men of his army, "Into battle today for your brothers." Dividing them into 3 commands, he advanced on the enemy's rear, with trumpets sounding and prayers shouted aloud. The troops of I keep getting his name stuck, Timotheus, recognizing that this was Maccabeus, fled before his advance. Maccabeus dealt them a crushing defeat. About 8,000 of their men fell that day. Then, wheeling on Elima, he attacked and captured it, and having killed all the males and collected the booty, burned the place down. From there he moved on and took Chaspo, Maked, Bosser, and the remaining towns of the Gilead. Imagine that. After these events, Timotheus mustered another force and pitched camp opposite of Raphan on the far side of the stream bed. Judas sent men to reconnoiter the camp, and these reported back as follows: "With him are massed all the Gentiles surrounding us, making a very numerous army, with Arab mercenaries as auxiliaries. They are encamped on the far side of the stream bed and ready to launch attack on you." Judas then advanced to engage them, and was approaching the watercourse with his troops, when Timotheus told his commanders of his army, "If he crosses first, we shall not be able to resist him, because he will have a great advantage over us. But if he is afraid and camps on the other side of the stream, we shall cross over to him, and the advantage will then be ours." And as soon as Judas reached the watercourse, he posted people's scribes along it, giving them this order: "Do not let anyone pitch his tent. All are to prepare to go into battle." He himself was the first to cross to the enemy's side, with all the people following. He defeated all the opposing Gentiles, who threw down their arms and ran for refuge in the sanctuary of Karnaim. The Jews first captured the town and then burned down the temple with everyone inside. And so Carnaim was overthrown, and the enemy could offer no further resistance to Judas. And I want to stop right here to make another quick little point. The Timotheus actually prophesied over himself the outcome of the battle before it happened. So it's kind of amazing how sometimes you gotta watch what you say. Um, Words are very strong. Um, the Jews first captured the town and then burned down the temple with everyone inside. And so Carnaim was overthrown, and the enemy could offer no further resistance to Judas. Next, Judas assembled all the Israelites living in Gilead, from the least to the greatest, with their wives, children, and belongings, an enormous muster to take them to Judea. They reached Ephraim, a large town straddling the road and strongly fortified. As it was impossible to bypass it either to the right or to the left, there was nothing for it but to march straight through. But the people of the town denied them passage and barricaded the gates with stones. Judas sent them a conciliatory message in these terms: "We want to pass through your territory to reach our own. No one will do any harm. We only want to go through on foot." But they would not open up for him. So Judas sent an order down the column for everyone to halt where he stood. The fighting men took up their positions. Judas attacked the town all day and night, and the town fell to him. He put all the males to the sword. He razed the town to the ground, plundered it, marched through the town square over the bodies of the dead. They then crossed the Jordan into the great plain opposite of Bethshean. Judas all the time rallying the stragglers and encouraging the people the whole way until they reached Judea. They climbed Mount Zion in joy and gladness and presented burnt offerings, because they had returned safe and sound without having lost a single man. While Judas and Jonathan were in Gilead, and Simon his brother in the Galilee outside of Ptolemais. Joseph, son of Zechariah, and Azariah, who were in command of the army, heard of their valiant deeds and of the battles they had been fighting, and said, "Let us make a name for ourselves too, and go and fight the nations around us." So they issued orders to the men under their command, and marched on Jamnia. Gorgias and his men came out of the town and gave battle. Joseph and Azariah were routed, and pursued as far as the frontiers of Judea. That day about 2,000 Israelites lost their lives. Other people thus met with great reverse, because they had not listened to Judas and his brothers, thinking that they would do something equally as valiant. They were not, however, of the same breed of men as those to whom the deliverance of Israel was entrusted. Notice what happens to those who try to profit off of a righteous act. Something we like to call karma, in this case, instantly. Um, there's a lot of good things in these stories that, even if you don't believe in history, I mean, they are kind of interesting stories. My sons really love these battle ones. They lay down and make the visions in their head of the destroying armies, and there's a lot of interesting truths that are hidden in them. Um, they were not, however, the same breed of men as to those who the deliverance of Israel is entrusted. I mean, it's a little hint that, hey, look up here in the story. There's a group of people that got what came deserving of them. The noble Judas and his brothers, however, were held in high honor throughout Israel, and all among the nations wherever their name was heard, and people thronged round to acclaim them. Judas marched out with his brothers to fight the Edomites in the country towards the south. He stormed Hebron and its dependent villages, threw down its fortifications, and burned down its encircling towers. Leaving there, he made for the country of the Philistines and passed through the Marissa. Among the fallen that day fighting were some of the priests who sought to prove their courage, thereby joining in the battle, a foolhardy venture. Judas next turned to Azotus, which belonged to the Philistines. He overthrew their altars, burned their statues of their gods, and having pillaged their towns, withdrew to Judea. Use station break. Take a minute here to get a drink. Teeny 101, thanks for joining us. Read a few of these real quick. I am got an addiction that I'm needing to lose again. After my wife and daughter were gone, I was extremely sick, and I actually found nicotine helped with one of the symptoms of a condition I was having where I kept having whiteouts and almost passed out. If anybody want to take some minute, I'm going to read through some chat things, maybe chat for a minute before we go on and smoke a cigarette here. Maybe take a hit. I loaded a device earlier. I just got to figure out which one it is. I'm very bad. I'm kind of strange. I take different devices to different occasions. Read weird. Let's see what we got comments on. Yes, Mystery Babylon by Bill Cooper is something very interesting to listen to. If there's a lot of good stuff that's come out over radio and internet as information is being released, and more of these old texts and scriptures are being open to the public and interpreted for us to read in our own languages. And some of these different things apply to more than one aspect, like Mystery Babylon, because there are very definite, clear pictures of America there, but there's also clear pictures on a spiritual level of what's going on within the actual battle between light and darkness. In regards to the selling of souls, us being merchandised as slaves. Um, there's um, I mean, it's kind of wild. You begin to see more and more of the light as you read and see these things happen over and over and over and over. I mean, the person who said that if we don't learn history, we're doomed to repeat it, and the fact that every scripture says that it's a repeating cycle. Um, it's easy to see what's coming next if we learn to look at what's happened over and over and over. The problem is we've been lied to and told we're in just one cycle. Okay, we were made, and in 6,000 years we're all going to die. Well, shoot, if you read history and begin to look at the monuments and stuff, you'll see that this is like at least a 250,000 cycle for what we call or 250,000 year cycle for what we call civilized man. Um, it's kind of hard to understand our current religious paradigms, and I believe that's what's being set up and structured is the destruction of those paradigms. And the reason why I called this throwing the baby out with the bathwater is it's designed to throw the truth out. And I want to, through the reading of this, try to, just bring across one thing. There's a creator, and we find it in everything we do. And we have a choice of giving our attention and trying to emulate that which creates or that which is created. And so as we read these stories, we'll begin to see some reoccurring things that happen spiritually. It's spiritual law. A lot of things we blame on the creator that are there because they're in a spiritual law. They're in a yin and a yang. They are in a sow and a reap. And we can't really blame God or a creator or whatever term we want to use because we'll find as we read these scriptures, these terms are there for a reason, because he is, or it is, I mean, you can't even really give a gender to it, because the creator is beyond our understanding. We do, through our religious talk, give genders, because that's what we're divided into. But the creator is a force. It is a word. It is a thing outside of all that is created. I mean, there's so much that you learn through all these different things. And when you begin to put these pieces together, it's like, wait a minute, we really don't have any control over a creator, because we are, as some would say, inside his dream. But in that, he has created us to become creators, which we'll see through all these texts as well. And if we emulate him, that's how we do that. And we begin to see that these stories are actually a story of light against darkness. So, as our nation may be a Babylon, there is also a greater Babylon happening worldwide right now. There's also a spiritual Babylon that's happening worldwide right now. And there's different truths hidden in each sect of things that's dividing, because the ultimate design of darkness is to form chaos, and the best way to do that is to steal all your truth. And I think the only way we can find it is quit arguing with each other and just start reading it. Just start reading these stories, begin to see what they say instead of taking everybody else's word for what they say. This is what began to give me the knowledge and understanding people think I have. It's not me. I'm repeating what I've learned from reading. I'm repeating what I see as repeating cycles. Um, there doesn't have to be a quote unquote magic to it when you begin to see spiritually. And seeing spiritually is learning to accept truths. And that's what I want this forum to be, is a place where we can begin to compare truths, compare differences, see why those are there, how do they lock our mind into a control system. Um, but those are the things that I'm aiming to accomplish through just reading. And I'm hoping, actually, in a way, that as people begin to realize that there is truly a creator, they begin to realize that he did intend a personal relationship, and that each one of us has, through that personal relationship, a personal walk. And that's the reason why judgment needs to go away, because we have no idea where each one of us is in that personal walk with that personal relationship. Cheers, Bingus. Thanks for joining us, my friend. You've missed quite a bit because I talk a lot, as you know. I'm reading through Maccabees today. I'm up to the 6th chapter. We're taking a little smoke break, um, which I'm going to have another puff on here in just a minute. Um, Discussing a few things between chapters. Um, Maccabees was a book that was taken out of what we call Holy Scripture, because it shows that there is a link between the Old and New Testament. It is a picture that is repeated over and over throughout all the different religious texts. It is a story that's repeated again at the end of the Revelation. It's repeated at least twice in our future. So I'm kind of reading through it. It's kind of a battle story. It's kind of bloody. My kids always enjoyed it. PA, thanks for joining us, buddy. If I missed anybody, I'm not a good reader and chatter at the same time, so I'm reading a chapter and take a little break and trying to figure out how this is going to work. It's kind of working out kind of well, because this is kind of how me and my kids would stop and talk and stuff. Budget Bud, cheers, bro. Do what you need to. This will be online. I'm planning on leaving them up. Continual reading. Just hopefully, as we begin to read these texts and examine them together, we can quit taking what everybody else keeps saying these things mean and begin to see the underlying story, that this is a history that's repeated many times before us. It's going to repeat again in our future, that we are on this journey as a special creature, that all these creatures have always been here through many different names. We're going to see these in all the different stories. We're going to read some things which are going to be fantasies, and they're going to be clearly listed and labeled as fantasies. We're going to be reading things labeled purely as allegories. We are going to begin to understand how these pictures go together, hopefully, and begin to find light and truth, as opposed to letting the lie steal all these truths from us, and begin to make our light shine brighter in our community by beginning to show the results, the peace that comes, the grace, the different, what have often been labeled spiritual fruits, or fruits of the spirit, or even virtues, or I mean, it's given many different names. Let's see, what are some of the other names? Moralities. As we begin to bless, and as we begin to live positive, and hopefully learn truths, we begin to shine brighter. And that's my only hope, is my little bitty light might be able to spark some other lights, and we can quit seeing so much of this system of fighting that keeps everybody divided, and begin to break these divides down. And darkness has been very good. It has set these control systems up in us through TV and through school and through our reading and through everything. And now it's time for us to remember the spiritual truths behind how light, even inside of a dark system, can shine. And that's kind of what I'm hoping to bring out. Cheers, everybody. Anybody joining us that does not smoke, which I'm sure, being that I'm in the community that is going to see this verse that does, realize that there are people who are sick, people who have different illnesses in different places, mind, soul, body, and spirit. Cannabis is a medicine that was given to us at the creation of man, pretty much, and it was written as one of the herbs that we were to ingest, to eat, and to use as food and medicine. And it's one of the things that was taken away from us to help our body begin to break down to the condition we're in today. I mean, most of us can remember, even our own parents' generation, that some of these illnesses that our children have were hardly ever spoken of. And I believe if we look back and see the 80-year history of Prohibition, we'll see that this is also part of a deliberate plan. And anyways, we'll get to that at another time. For those of you that don't smoke or use, that see this in the future, we do not judge you. We understand that there is also a place. There's those who can't, those who don't, those who shouldn't. And you're welcome here, welcome in the discussion. You're welcome even to discuss the issue of marijuana with the people here. And let's just remember, this is chat where we're not going to attack each other personally, but we're going to discuss the ideas. So as I partake, as I helps me sit here longer to talk, because I've got degenerative back disease and I have Crohn's, which are both positions. Sitting long times doesn't help. So, cheers. As far as smoking cigarettes, I do not condone it. It's not good for me either. I went to vaping for a number of years and have recently switched back on a mistake. So, don't advocate that either. Something I'm trying to do is one of my little side projects is I'm going to begin to make little virtues videos. Basically, I think many of us have began to take the world's definition for a lot of these virtues, and we've forgotten what they really mean. What was taught to us as strict morality was plain being nice to other people, and we threw the baby out with the bathwater there, and we've forgotten a lot of these virtues and have allowed the world to affect us in our thinking. And I'm going to do little short reminder videos that aren't kind of preachy, but are reminders of what the virtues are. And if anybody's got any ideas they want to help me at some other time, I'd like to sit and chat about those. Um, I used to run and do movies and videos and stuff, but it's been years ago with computer-aided programs that are no longer usable on my computer and stuff like that. So I've got some learning to do about what's freely accessible and other issues to work out on that. But Bingus, let's see, I saw a neat question there at the end. Is there any idea of how many Earth civilizations there have been? Um, the only way I can answer that is from what I have read that indicates, and it's from the Indian text, that we are, let's see if I get this right, we are in the sixth generation of man, and each one of those generations had 6 segments of it, and we are like in the 5th segment of the 6th generation or something. We'll have to read through that because I may not have those numbers exactly right. But those are found, I believe it's the Mahabharata in the histories of the creations. And it talks about the Atlantean civilizations and the civilizations before that, the genesis of man and how we were originally, our spirit was created, etc., etc. So, anyways, that is one of the texts I hope to get into. I'm not going to back that far up right away. I think there's some interesting stuff that's really applicable to our time right now, found in some of the Sumerian texts and some of the Egyptian texts. And after this Maccabees, I think that's where I'm going to start. Um, Absolutely, Teeny. I'm. We've been told what the devil is, and as we begin to read these scripts, we're going to get a different picture. We're going to find that there are actual entities, not just one, but there are actual entities that are in positions of leadership in these areas, but there are also spiritual aspects and ideas to these things, and we can be caught in a system that is devilish, so to speak. But like I said, this is an open forum, and as I read, y'all are free to discuss any of this stuff. Just keep it friendly. I do plan on covering much, and all of this stuff comes out as we read. I I don't want to form any theologies. That's not my aim here, and I'm sure some of my ideas are going to change as we read through these because as every time I read, I see new stuff. I see new interlinkings between things I had just read where I hadn't read them for some time, and I think other people will too. I think one of the things stolen from us is just the plain and simple fact that we need to actually sit down and just read this stuff ourselves and quit taking everybody else's word for it. That being said, I'm going to continue with today's reading in chapter 6 with this battle that's going on. It's a pretty good war. Um, King Antiochus, once again, our mind that he is a Greek king, meanwhile was making his way through the upper provinces. He had heard that in Persia there was a city called Elamias, renowned for its riches, its silver and gold, and its very wealthy temple containing golden armor, breastplates, and weapons, left there by Alexander, the son of Philip, the king of Macedon, the first to reign over the Greeks. And I'll interject, that was Alexander the Great. He therefore went and attempted to take the city and pillage it, but without success, the citizens having been forewarned. They resisted him by force of arms, and he was routed and began retreating very gloomily towards Babylon. But while he was still in Persia, which is, uh, yeah, my brain just short circuited in Iran, news reached him that the armies which had invaded Judea had been routed, and that Lysias in particular had advanced in massive strength only to be forced to turn and flee before the Jews. The latter were now stronger than ever, thanks to the arms, supplies, and abundant spoils acquired from the armies they had cut to pieces, and that they had pulled down the abomination which he had erected on the altar in Jerusalem, had encircled the sanctuary with high walls, as in the past, and had fortified Bethzur, one of his cities. When the king heard this news, he was amazed and profoundly shaken. He threw himself on his bed and fell sick with grief, so things had not turned out for him as he had planned. Now remember, guys, this is Antiochus Epiphanes, the king of Greece, ruling over 1/4 of the known world. And there he remained for many days, subject to deep and recurrent fits of melancholy, until he was realized that he was dying. So there's another clue that you can get so melancholy over your losses that you can actually bring yourself to death, but it can be a mental thing. Then summoning all of his friends, he said to them, "Sleep evades my eyes, and my heart is cowed by my anxiety. I have been wondering how I could have come to such a pitch of distress. So great a flood as to that which engulfs me, I, who was so generous and well loved in my heyday. But now I recall how I wrongly acted in Jerusalem when I seized all the vessels of silver and gold, and there ordered the extermination of the inhabitants of Judah for no reason at all. This, I am convinced, is why these misfortunes have overtaken me, and why I am dying of melancholy in a foreign land." He summoned Philip, one of his friends, and made him regent of the whole kingdom. He entrusted him with his diadem, his robe, and his signet, and the understanding that he was to educate his son Antiochus and train him for the throne. King Antiochus then died. The year was 149. So Antiochus, in a spiritual state, brought on such a heavy anxiety, he actually died under his own anxiety. Lysias, learning that the king was dead, established on the throne in succession to him his son Antiochus, whom he had brought up from childhood, and styled him as Eupator. The people in the citadel at the time were blockading Israel around the sanctuary, and were taking every opportunity to harm them and support the Gentiles. Judas decided that they must be destroyed, and he mobilized the whole people to besiege them. They assembled and laid siege to the citadel in the year 150, building batteries and siege engines. But some of the besieged broke through the blockade, and these a number of renegades from Israel attached themselves. They made their way to the king and said, "How much longer are you going to wait before you see justice done to avenge our fellows? We were content to serve your father, to comply with his orders, and to obey his edicts. As a result, our own people have nothing to do with us. What is more, they have killed all those of us they could catch and looted our family property. Nor is it on us alone that their blows have fallen, but on all our territories." At this moment, they were laying siege to the citadel in Jerusalem to capture it, and they have fortified the sanctuary and Bethzur. Unless you forestall them at once, they will go on to even bigger things, and then you will never be able to control them. The king was furious when he heard this, and summoned all of his friends, the general of his forces, and the marshals of horse. He recruited mercenaries from other kingdoms and the Mediterranean islands. His forces numbered 100,000 foot soldiers, 20,000 cavalry, and 32 elephants with experience of battle conditions. They advanced through the Idumea and besieged Bethzur, pressing the attack for days on end. They also constructed siege engines, but the defenders made a sortie and set them on fire, putting up a brave resistance. At this, Judas left the citadel and pitched camp at Beth Zechariah opposite the royal encampment. The king rose at daybreak and marched his army at top speed to the road to Beth Zechariah, where his forces took up their battle formations and sounded the trumpets. The elephants were given a syrup of grapes and mulberries to prepare them for battle. It's an interesting thing. These animals were distributed among the phalanxes, each elephant being allocated 1,000 men dressed in coats of mail with bronze helmets on their heads. 500 picked horsemen were also assigned to each beast. Notice that there was coats of mails and bronze helmets before the Middle Ages. The horsemen anticipated every move their elephant made. Wherever it went, they went with it, never quitting it. On each elephant to protect it was a stout wooden tower, kept in position by girths, each with 3 combatants, as well as its mahout, which I believe is its driver. The remainder of the cavalry was stationed on one or other of the 2 flanks of the army to harass the enemy and to cover the flanks. When the sun glinted on the bronze and golden shields, the mountains caught the glint, and the gleam was like fiery torches. One part of the royal army was deployed on the upper slopes of the mountain, and the other in the valley below. They advanced in solid, well-disciplined formation. Everyone trembled at the noise made by their vast multitude, the thunder of the troops on the march, and the clanking of their armor, for it was an immense and mighty army. Judas and his army advanced to give battle, and 600 of the king's army were killed. Eliezer, called Avron, noticing that one of the elephants was royally caparisoned and was also was royally caparisoned and was also taller than all the others, and supporting the king was mounted on it, sacrificed himself to save his people and win an imperishable name. Yeah, let's get us a name. Boldly charging toward the creature through the thick of the flanks, dealing death to the right and left, so that the enemy scattered on either side in his onslaught. He darted in under the elephant, thrusted it from underneath, and killed it. The beast collapsed on top of him, and he died on the spot. And if you want a name, that's how you get it, guys, because people are now reading about it thousands of years later. The Jews, however, realizing how strong the king was and how ferocious his army, retreated ahead of them. The royal army moved up to encounter them outside Jerusalem, and the king began to blockade Judea and Mount Zion. He granted peace terms to the people of Bethzer, who evacuated the town. It lacked store of provisions to withstand a siege, since the land was enjoying a sabbatical year. And I'll stop real quick to explain that every 6 years, the people collected all their harvests and saved it up. And on the 7th year, they did not plant the land. They gave it a chance to rest, and that was called the sabbatical year. And they just ate on what they stored from the 6th year. And that was supposed to last them for 2 years until they were able to harvest the next year. So they had very meager provisions during that time of year, or during that particular year. And then there was also other years that you find out they had great provision during those years, but we'll find that in some of the stories. Having occupied Bethzer, the king stationed a garrison there to hold it. He besieged the sanctuary for a long time, erecting batteries and siege engines, flamethrowers and ballistas, scorpions to discharge arrows, and catapults. Once again, people notice that this is what we would call BC. So for them to tell us in school that these were all invented during the Middle Ages, around 1400, how many times has history repeated itself? The defenders countered these by constructing their own engines, and were thus able to prolong their resistance. But they had no food in their stores, since it was the 7th year, and because those who had taken refuge in Judea from the Gentiles had eaten up the last of their reserves. Only a few men were left in the holy place. Owing to the severity of the famine, the rest had dispersed and gone home. Meanwhile, Philip, whom King Antiochus before his death had appointed to train his son Antiochus for the throne, had returned from Persia and Media with forces and had accompanied the king, and was planning to seize control of affairs. On hearing this, Lysias at once decided to leave, and said to the king, the generals of the army, and the men, "We are growing weaker every day. We are short of food, and the place we are besieging is well fortified. Moreover, the affairs of the kingdom demand our attention. Let us offer the hand of friendship to these men, and make peace with them and with their whole nation. Let us grant them permission to follow their own customs as before, since it is our abolition of these customs that has provoked them into acting like this. And I'm going to make a little brief analogy here that you can shoot me down for later. But I think anytime we purposely set ourselves to abolish somebody else's customs, no matter what those customs are, we invoke a spiritual law. And whether or not we believe that the Jews were right in their customs or not, that this spiritual law does affect us in many different other areas. And that is something we need to be careful of, because people have customs for very specific reasons. And if we attack them unjustly, as with this story, it can come back to bite you, bring curses on you. The king and his commanders approved this argument, and he offered the Jews peace terms, which they accepted. The king and the generals ratified the treaty by oath, and the besieged accordingly left the fortress. The king then entered Mount Zion, but in seeing on how impregnable the place was, he broke the oath he swore, and he gave orders for the encircling wall to be demolished. He then hurriedly withdrew, making off for Antioch, where he found Philip already master of the city. Antiochus gave battle and captured the city by force of arms. So what we see is he breaks an oath and goes back and finds that his own city, in his own territory, by his own countryman, was suffering the same thing he was just putting somebody else through. These are the kind of things I want us to look for in these stories, because even if we take them allegorically, we can begin to see how they can help us in our lives and how we can keep from repeating some of these spiritual mistakes. It's time for a little break here. Give me a good drink. Spin around here for just a second. Gotta grab me a moringa nut. Let's see what we got going on here. I'd like to thank everybody who's with us here. All the thumbs up that you guys have given us. And a couple little vitamins right off my tree from outside. Moringa also have a anti-inflammatory effect. Absolutely, Mr. Bone. Kill, steal, and destroy. What's funny is what we now call entertainment is almost all built on killing, stealing, and destroying. And what used to be moral allegories as to what happens if you kill, steal, and destroy, and the positive results of being moral as opposed to killing and destroying, has changed to where the killing and destroying is now what is glorified, and those who can kill and destroy the best are those that are glorified. And we're actually getting to the point where it no longer matters what your morality is, as long as you can kill, steal, and destroy better than others, you are being glorified. So we are watching the downfall. People who study history will say, as the Romans began to take entertainment to the forefront and began to fulfill every lust, every desire to kill, steal, and destroy, that was their downfall. And the one thing we can take away from it all is that when it happens, the blessed the ones who live righteously, who continue to follow the light under these systems, end up being the ones left over in the land. And we'll see this over and over in these stories. Justin Gooder, thanks for joining us today on this Sabbath. I've been reading through Maccabees, trying to show how some of these stories have been stolen from us and how they all have different truths in them. I plan on reading different stuff each week, reading through some of these different texts. We'll go different lengths of time. We're coming up to a good breaking place on this one shortly. I just wanted to show the full thing of the story of the battle because it shows a history, and we'll see how history repeats itself over and over. Cheers, everyone. In my journey, I've never been locked into one particular denomination or faith or particular mode of belief because, as you'll find as we go through these things, little things always click to me and I always begin to ask questions that become uncomfortable no matter where I'm at to people. And so I've never been made to feel comfortable staying in one place for a particularly long time. And it's amazing how I've seen some of these cycles repeated over and over in each place I've been, and how each one of these places holds on to a piece of truth to the point that they're willing to fight. And that very action of being so strong-headed actually makes them violate so many of the things they very hold on to and willing to fight for. And I think as we begin to see that history is a religious story of a story of light against darkness, we begin to see more clearly what those things are. It's interesting that what we consider the fall of man was mankind becoming aware of the battle of good versus evil or light versus darkness, because it is not the tree of evil, it is the tree of the knowledge or the understanding of good and of evil. And it's that understanding that makes us responsible for decisions. And history is the story of what happens when we make certain decisions. And those decisions and those stories show a spiritual law that is in place that we can learn to live within the blessing of as opposed to live within the curse of. Blessed hands. I don't remember if I said hello to you either. So hello. Thanks for joining. I'm going to continue on here. We've made it up to the year 151. Demetrius, son of Seleucus, left Rome and arrived with a few men at a town on the coast, where he inaugurated his reign. It so happened, as he was entering the royal residence of his ancestors, the army captured Antiochus and Lysias and intended to bring them to him. So people understand what we're following is now a Roman general has come and conquered the Greeks. On hearing this, he said, "Keep them out of my sight." The army put them to death, and Demetrius ascended his throne. Next, all of those Israelites with law or piety, led by Alcimus, whose ambition was to become high priest, approached the king and denounced our people to him. Judas and his brothers, they said, have killed all our friends, and he has driven us out of our country. Send someone now whom you can trust. Let him go and see the wholesale ruin Judas has brought on us and on our king's domains, and let him punish the wretches and all who assist them. The king chose Bacchides, Bacchides, I believe, one of his friends of the king, governor of the Trans-Euphrates, an important personage in the kingdom and loyal to the king. He sent him with the godless Alcimus, whom he confirmed in the high priesthood, with orders to exact retribution from the Israelites, or to take taxes. So they set out with a large force, and on reaching Judea, sent emissaries to Judas and his brothers with proposals peaceable yet treacherous. It sounds like our government. Peaceable yet treacherous. The latter, however, did not put any faith in their words, aware that they had come with a large force. Nevertheless, a commission of scribes presented themselves before Alcimus and Bacchides to sue for just terms. The first among them, the Israelites, to ask for peace terms were the Hasidians, who reasoned thus: "This is a priest of Aaron's line who has come with armed forces. He will not wrong us." He did, in fact, discuss peace terms with them and gave them his oath: "We shall not attempt to injure you or your friends." They believed him, and he arrested 60 of them and put them to death on one day, fulfilling the words of Scripture, which is found in another set of books we'll read later. "They have scattered the bodies of your faithful and shed their blood all around Jerusalem, leaving no one to bury them." At this, fear and dread gripped the whole people. "There's no truth or virtue in them," they said. "They have broken their agreement and their sworn oath." Bacchides then left Jerusalem and camped at Bethzeth, and from there sent and arrested many of the men who deserted him, and a few of our people too. He had them killed and thrown down the great well. And every time you hear the word Beth, that means the house of Zeth. Beth means house. He then put Alcimus in charge of the province, leaving an army with him to support him. Bacchides himself returned to the king. Alcimus continued his struggle to become high priest, and all who were disturbing the peace of their own people rallied to him, and having won control of Judea, did much harm in Israel. And this is actually, if you listen to this, this is the setup of what put Herod in Jerusalem at the time of Christ. This is the organization of the Sadducees and the Pharisees and all that kind of stuff you see in the biblical scriptures. This is its start. It's one of the reasons why it was yanked out of scriptures. Seeing that all the wrongs done to the Israelites by Alcimus and his supporters exceeded what the Gentiles had done, Judas went right round the whole territory of Judea to take vengeance on those who deserted him, and to prevent their free movement about the country. When Alcimus saw how strong Judas and his supporters had grown, and realized that he was powerless to resist them, he went back to the king, to whom he had made malicious accusations against them. The king sent Nicanor, one of his generals, ranking as illustrious and a bitter enemy of Israel, with orders to exterminate the people. Reaching Jerusalem with a large force, Nicanor sent a friendly yet gesturous message to Judas and his brothers as follows: "Let us have no fighting between you and me. I shall come with a small escort for a peaceful meeting with you." He met Judas, and they exchanged friendly greetings. The enemy, however, had made preparation to abduct Judas. When Judas became aware of Nicanor's treacherous purpose in coming to see him, he took fright and refused any further meeting. Nicanor realized that his plan had been discovered, and took the field against Judas to give battle near Kafir Salama. About 500 of Nicanor's men fell. The rest took siege in the city of David. After these events, Nicanor went up to Mount Zion. Some of the priests came out of the holy place with some elders to give him a friendly welcome and show him the burnt offering being presented for the king. But he ridiculed them, laughing at them, defiled them, and used insolent language, swearing in his rage, "Unless Judas is handed over to me this time with his army, as soon as I am safely back, I promise you I shall burn this building down." Then he went off in a fury. At this the priests went in again and stood weeping in front of the altar in the temple, saying, "You have chosen this house and called by your name to be a house of prayer and a petition for your people. Take vengeance on this man and on his army, and let them fall by the sword. Remember their blasphemies and give them no respite." Just a quick note here, they are turning and addressing the creator of all creation for some justice. So let's watch. Nicanor left Jerusalem and encamped at Beth Horon, where he was joined by an army from Syria. Judas meanwhile camped at Edessa with 3,000 men and offered this prayer: "When the king's envoys blasphemed, your angel went out and struck down 185,000 of his men." Now, listen carefully. Your angel went out and struck down 100,000. He's referencing a spiritual force that went out and killed 185,000 of the enemy's men. He's talking about a story that we find in the Old Testament that people gloss over real quick. Okay, it's an angel. God sent an angel. But as we're coming into these last days, let's begin to look and see what's happening around us as some of these catastrophes occur. In the same way, let us see you crush this army today, so that everyone else may know that this man has spoken blasphemously against your sanctuary. Pass judgment on him as his wickedness deserves. The armies met in the battle on the 13th of the month of Adar, and Nicanor's army was crushed, he himself being the first to fall in the battle. When Nicanor's soldiers saw him fall, they threw down their arms and fled. The Jews pursued them a day's journey from Edessa to the approaches of Gezer. There they sounded their trumps in warning, and they followed them. And the people came out of all the surrounding Judean villages, encircling the fugitives, who then turned back to their own men. All fell by the sword, not one being left alive. Having collected the spoils and the booty, they cut off Nicanor's head, and the right hand he had stretched out in a display of insolence. These were taken and displayed within the sight of Jerusalem. Now, everybody who sees all these symbols that keep occurring over and over and are really big into conspiracy, notice right here what was taken: his head and his right hand, who were what? Symbols of his insolence. So, those are some things that keep coming up over and over in these stories. We'll see it in the old gods as well as in the stories of what's coming up in the future. The people were overjoyed and kept that day as a great holiday. Indeed, they decided to celebrate it annually on the 13th of Adar. For a short while, Judea enjoyed peace. And once again, that's the reinforcing of Hanukkah. Here we are, another break, and I'm going to look and see. There's one of these chapters which we can stop at and really not lose anything. I mean, there's a continued history of it, but kind of wraps it up. I think this next one's the one that wraps it up. And then it kind of then starts over into another story. Thanks for being with us, Teeny. Appreciate you joining us. I think I'm going to read one more chapter for this particular video, and then probably during the week I will record the rest of Maccabees as a separate video just to stand alone if anybody wants to listen to the rest of the story. I really just wanted to read it kind of as a kickoff, a reminder to me of what I used to do, as well as a thing to show that, no matter how we take these, if we begin to look at them, we can begin to see that there's truth in a lot of it, and to you know, quit calling everything religious and begin to realize the spiritual truths of them. And we've been our truths have been stolen from us by the very words that they've used. We begin to form this framework in our mind where we don't even listen to it, and we've lost the truth. And that's been my whole goal. And ever since I was a young boy, the one prayer I've always had is help me see the truth, because I hate being lied to. And actually, in my time in walking away from truth, it made me very good at lying, because I knew the structure of truth and how to shine through it. And as we learn about those who are in opposition to truth, you'll find that's very true. They are very good liars, many of them with no conscience even. And we have no way of judging that. The only thing we can do is look and see what the outcomes of things are. And that's the reason why, you gotta be cautious. There's one place that says to be wise as a serpent and gentle as a dove. You don't have to go out and venomously attack people like a serpent would, because you see a difference. But you can be smart enough to stay away from it and fly off if it's coming after you, or to tell that truth in such a way that you're not offensive. You bring peace, which is what the dove is a symbol of. You find all these things tied together. It's kind of fun with words. In a way, words are magic, but we'll discuss that another time too. Um, I am going to read one last chapter for this video, and I'm going to go find me a snack, because fortunately the recent acquisition is a medicine that makes me hungry. Now Judas had heard of the reputation of the Romans, how strong they were, and how well disposed toward any who made common cause with them, making a treaty of friendship with any who approached them. And indeed, they were extremely powerful. He had been told of their wars and of their prowess against the Gauls, which were the French and etc., Spanish, whom they had conquered and plundered under tribute, and all that they had done in the province of Spain to gain possession of the silver and the gold mines that are there, making them masters of the whole country by their determination and perseverance, despite its great distance from their own, of the kings who came from the ends of the earth to attack them, only to be crushed by them and overwhelmed with disasters, and of others who paid them annual tribute. And these are the stories we learn in school, of the great wonders of the Roman Empire and the Roman age that we now live under, etc., etc. So this is actually a tie-in that helps us understand how that age occurred. Philip Perseus, king of Kittim, and others who had dared to make war on them had been defeated and reduced to subjugation, while Antiochus the Great, king of Asia, who had advanced to attack them with 120 elephants, cavalry, chariots, and a very large army, had also suffered defeat at their hands. They had taken him alive and imposed on him and his successors, on agreed terms, the payment of an enormous tribute, the surrender of hostages, and the cession of the Indian territory, with the Media, Lydia, and some of their best province, which they took from him and gave to King Eumenes, or Eumenes. We'll find that in history as well, that being in India, and where the Romans handed it out to. Judas also heard how, when the Greeks planned an expedition to destroy the Romans, the latter had got wind of it, and sending a single general against them, had fought a campaign in which they inflicted heavy casualties, carried their women and children away into captivity, pillaged their goods, subdued their country, tore down their fortresses, and reduced them to slavery lasting to the present day. And how they had destroyed and subjugated all the other kingdoms and islands that resisted them. But where their friends and those who relied on them were concerned, they had always stood by their friendship. They had subdued kings far and near, and all who had heard their name went in terror of them. One man, if they determined to help him and advance him to a throne, would certainly occupy it, while another, if they so determined, would find him deposed. Their influence was paramount. In spite of all this, no single one of them had assumed a crown or put on purple for his own aggrandizement. They had set up a senate where 320 counselors deliberated daily, constantly debating how best to regulate public affairs. All right, now I want everybody to listen for just a second. These people who have a government, have no crown, didn't wear all the vestments. Okay, this is a creation of a secret government back at the time before Rome, or as Rome was establishing itself. Once again, a good reason for this book to be pulled away. It kind of shows how they began their little thingy. They entrusted the government to one man for a year at a time, with absolute power over their whole empire, and this man was obeyed by all without envy or jealousy. Having chosen Eupolemus, son of John, of the family of Achos, and Jason, son of Eleazar, Judas sent them to Rome to make a treaty of friendship and alliance with these people, in a hope of being rid of the yoke, for they could see that the Greek rule was reducing Israel to slavery. The envoys made a lengthy journey to Rome and presented themselves before the Senate with their formal proposal. Judas Maccabeus and his brothers with the Jewish people have sent us to you to conclude a treaty of alliance and peace with you, to enroll ourselves as your allies and friends. The proposal met with the approval of the senators. Here is a copy of the rescript which they engraved on bronze tablets and sent to Jerusalem, to be kept by the Jews as a record of peace and alliance. Good fortune attend the Romans and the Jewish nation by sea and land forever. May sword or enemy be far from them. If war comes, first to Rome or any of her allies throughout her dominions, the Jewish nation will take action as her ally, as occasion may require, and do it wholeheartedly. They will not give or supply to the enemy any grain, arms, money, or ships. Thus has Rome decided, and they are to honor their obligation without guarantees. Now, did you just hear that? In the same way, if war comes to the Jewish nation, the Romans will support them energetically as the occasion may offer, and the aggressor will not be furnished with grain, arms, money, or ships. Such is the Roman decision, and they will honor these obligations without treachery. Such are the articles under which the Romans have concluded their treaty with the Jewish people. If later either party should decide to make any addition or deletion, they will be free to do so, and any such addition or deletion will be binding. As regards the wrongs done to them by King Demetrius, we have written to him in these terms: Why have you made your yoke lie heavy on our friends and allies, the Jews? If they appeal against you, we shall uphold their rights and make war on you by sea and by land. And the rest, as I will say, is a history that we are more familiar with, because from there it's pretty much written. However, these little agreements and stuff that were made that are binding within the spiritual realm, we'll see that these are all part of an ongoing battle as we begin to read stuff later and go through this stuff. For everybody who joined me, I thank you. Appreciate you coming, and I hope this brought some peace to your day, that you found a little bit of enlightenment, that you were able to enjoy at least some reading of the story, if nothing else. Take care. Have a blessed day. A little later this afternoon, I'm not sure exactly what time, weather providing, and going to go make a walk and try to decide where that is by how bright the sun is. If it's looking pretty bad, I may go walk my usual spot, but if it's looking like we have a little window of opportunity, I may go find a little beach or causeway or something to walk down and see what we can get ourselves into today. But that's just my Sabbaths and how I plan on continuing my life the way that I have now since, 20 some odd years. And I invite people to join me. I just want to have a fun time with my family, and this has become my family. And I appreciate that. I appreciate everybody's blessings, and I really believe it's important that we do that we learn to bless people. It's the reason why I always say shalom, which is a greeting, meaning that the peace of Creator be with you, that His peace be on you, which means His comforting, His supplying of your needs, all that kind of stuff is balled up in that one word, and it's often used as a greeting as well as a closing. So, goodbye, everybody. Have a great day, and shalom.